Presencia de nuestras autoridades, del doctor Mauricio Sánchez Menchero, director del CEIICH, y el doctor Julio Juárez Gámiz, secretario académico de este centro. Asimismo, damos la bienvenida a nuestro invitado especial, el doctor Jason Moore, de la Universidad de Binghamton en Nueva York, quien por motivos de salud no pudo acompañarnos de manera presencial, pero impartirá su conferencia a distancia. A continuación, toma la palabra el doctor Mauricio Sánchez Menchero.
Muy buenas tardes a todas y todos los aquí presentes. Es un gusto enorme para mí y para todo el CEIICH el tener esta primera actividad que nos ayuda a conmemorar estos 40 años de fundación del centro. Eh, Quiero empezar haciendo nada más las autoridades que están invitadas y que dijeron que venían, vienen en camino porque estábamos en CTH. Yo me tuve que salir antes para estar aquí presentes a tiempo, pero no tardarán en venir. Entonces, pues un saludo a los directores de entidades académicas que nos van a hacer favor de acompañarnos, pero lo hago ya también de manera presencial al doctor Fernando Rafael Castañeda Sabido, director general de Asuntos del Personal Académico. Muchas gracias, Fernando, por tu presencia en este acto conmemorativo de nosotros. Y también lo repito, a las demás personalidades que nos van a acompañar y que en un momento más llegarán aquí a estar presentes en el auditorio. Agradezco a todo el personal académico que también nos acompaña de otras entidades. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Desde luego también al personal de confianza administrativo de la UNAM. Muchas gracias por su presencia. Justo estábamos hablando de el doctor Fernando Lozano. Muchas gracias, director del CRIM, estábamos en CTH, ya salimos de una reunión y ahora estamos por acá. Bueno, para seguir cumpliendo con el protocolo, desde luego darle la bienvenida al doctor eh, Jason Moore, quien será nuestro conferencista magistral. Igualmente agradezco al doctor Julio Juárez la organización de este evento académico. Muchas gracias, Julio, por tu trabajo. Y bueno, pues a los de casa del CEIICH, desde ayer ya estábamos celebrando. Y quiero comentar al respecto que a lo largo de este tiempo, de estas 4 décadas, ha sido muy importante la presencia y el trabajo de cada uno de los investigadores, de las técnicas y los técnicos. Y comentábamos ayer, tuvimos un evento prácticamente de casa, donde y develamos un nuevo mural fotográfico de todos los integrantes que conformamos este centro. Y dentro de las anécdotas que surgieron ayer fueron los comentarios, porque este mural fotográfico fue hecho en el 2000, entre el 2007 y 2008. Teníamos duda de cuándo fue hecho estas fotos. En su momento, la mayor parte realizadas por Pedro Valtierra. Y el año pasado, a fines del año pasado, tuvimos una nueva muestra de fotografías con una persona, Cristina del MUAC, de la UNAM, y pues tratamos de celebrar estos 40 años estrenando un nuevo mural de fotos. Pero el comentario era si habían pasado estos 20 años en balde o no, si nos reconocíamos en el mural que dejábamos y si nos reconocíamos en el nuevo. Estaba en el aire los 40 años del centro y en particular de los 20 años de este mural. Y bueno, el día de ayer que comenzamos con estas celebraciones, justo cuando nos dirigíamos a develar este nuevo mural, producido durante el año pasado y que relevaría el testimonio visual de un viejo mural con 20 años de antigüedad, no faltaron los comentarios y bromas alrededor de los cambios físicos de cada uno y una de los integrantes del CEIICH. Situación que me hizo recordar el poema Pasatiempo de Mario Benedetti, y que ahora les leo de manera parafraseada y con respeto al gran poeta Benedetti, en este marco gozoso y celebratorio, y creo que lo tomemos así, es académico, pero si me permiten este espacio, solamente para comentar lo siguiente. Cuando entramos a trabajar a la UNAM, los eméritos nos parecían de 80. Un libro escrito era un océano y la jubilación lisa y llanamente no existía. Luego, cuando fuimos investigadores asociados, los eméritos se acercaban a los 70. Un proyecto era un océano y la jubilación solamente era una palabra. Ya cuando alcanzamos la titularidad C, los jubilados estaban en los 60. Un artículo era un océano y la jubilación empezó a ser la nuestra. Pero de manera más formal, quisiera recordar con todas y todos ustedes que desde su fundación, el centro apostó de manera decidida por la investigación interdisciplinaria, no como una consigna retórica, sino como una necesidad frente a la complejidad creciente de los problemas contemporáneos. A lo largo de estas 4 décadas, distintas generaciones de investigadoras e investigadores, técnicas y técnicos académicos, así como personal administrativo, han construido una comunidad diversa, plural y profundamente comprometida con los valores de la UNAM. El CEICH no es solo una entidad académica, es un espacio vivo, sostenido por el trabajo cotidiano, el intercambio constante y la colaboración entre personas con trayectorias y saberes distintos. Celebrar los 40 años del CEICH es, por tanto, celebrar una forma de hacer universidad, una universidad que piensa en colectivo, que dialoga, que se cuestiona y que se renueva. Es también reafirmar nuestro compromiso con una UNAM crítica, incluyente y socialmente responsable. Por eso, rememorar en conjunto y a lo largo de este 2026 sobre esta herencia es un buen marco para poder celebrar este logro colectivo de todas y todos. Para ello, las y los invito a sumarse para participar en otras actividades que vamos a tener a lo largo de este año. Desde luego que estas actividades a desarrollar, vamos a buscar construir con todas y todos ustedes una serie de actividades extra, pero también de convivencia artística y deportiva. Pero desde luego, y como parte de esta primera actividad organizada, contamos con la conferencia magistral que el día de hoy imparte el doctor Jason Moore. Muchas gracias, al que doy nuevamente la más cordial bienvenida. Muchas felicidades y larga vida al CEICH.
Habla el doctor Julio Juárez Gámiz, secretario académico de este centro.
Muchas gracias y muy buenos días nuevamente a todas y a todos en este, pues que es, digamos, el comienzo de una serie de eventos que tenemos pensados para conmemorar estos 40 años. Siempre es un dilema cuando uno se siente a organizar este tipo de actividades y quiere hacer lucir a su casa, al CEICH, hacer lucir los temas que nos han distinguido por muchos años, nuestras posiciones críticas, nuestra visión sobre la epistemia, la creación del conocimiento, sobre distintos temas que van desde el feminismo hasta la ecología, que nos han convocado por todas estas décadas en un proyecto primigenio, original, planteado e imaginado originalmente por el doctor don Pablo González Casanova, eh, y pensar en quiénes podrían honrar esta tradición, quiénes podrían nutrir y ayudarnos a sacarle mayor lustro a estos 40 años. Indudablemente el hecho de que tengamos hoy al doctor Jason Moore como invitado, pues obedece en gran medida a estas conversaciones que hemos tenido entre colegas. No es fácil tomar esas decisiones, pero sin embargo creemos que el día de hoy arrancamos con un evento y con una reflexión que me parece sumamente pertinente y tiene que ver con el papel de la universidad en el siglo XXI, es decir, en la actualidad, en la coyuntura, en las múltiples variantes y vértices de crisis que se abren frente a nosotros y que miramos desde la universidad y en la universidad, traer una voz que nos motive, que nos convoque, que nos llame no solamente al cuestionamiento y a la crítica fundada, sino también al diálogo, al debate, a la conversación, el papel de esta presentación del trabajo del doctor Jason Moore, de quien leeré su biografía muy brevemente, muy sintéticamente, para darle la palabra posteriormente, nutre y cumple precisamente con este objetivo, con esta visión y con este propósito. Creemos, por lo tanto, que este tipo de personalidades contribuyen y han sido parte de la historia del centro. Indudablemente la lista es larguísima, simplemente revisar quienes nos han visitado en estos 40 años, tanto del interior del país como de la región, como del mundo entero, ha sido enriquecedor y muy, muy grato observar que el centro ha tenido una vinculación nacional, internacional, subnacional, fantástica, nutritiva, eh, muy, muy gratificante. Y sin embargo, pues uno solo puede tomar e invitar a un número muy selecto de personas. Así que no digo todo esto, Jason, para elevar el compromiso que tienes en tu presentación, sino al contrario, para reconocerte y agradecer nuevamente tu participación y que hayas aceptado. Lamentablemente, como ya lo decía Mauricio, el doctor Moore tuvo una infección en el oído que le impide abordar un avión y acompañarnos aquí de manera presencial. Por lo tanto, tenemos su participación por esta vía, pero indudablemente el valor y la oportunidad de conversar con él están presentes, son vigentes y aprovechémosle en lo más que podamos. Así que procedo muy brevemente a leer el resumen biográfico para quienes no tengan un conocimiento pleno del doctor Jason Moore. Él es un historiador, geógrafo y profesor de sociología en los Estados Unidos de América, nacido en los Estados Unidos de América. Moore se licenció en Ciencias Políticas por la Universidad de Oregon en 1994. Posteriormente estudió Historia en la Universidad de California, en el plantel, el campus de Santa Cruz, completando su maestría en 1997. En 2007 se doctoró en Geografía por la Universidad de California en Berkeley, trabajando a continuación de profesor en varias universidades, tanto en los Estados Unidos como fuera de los Estados Unidos de América. Moore investiga y escribe sobre la relación entre el capitalismo y el medio ambiente, centrado especialmente en el desarrollo histórico y en las crisis contemporáneas. Desde 2013 imparte clases de Historia Mundial y Ecología Mundial en la Universidad de Binghamton, en el Departamento de Sociología, desde donde, perdón, coordina la red de investigación de Ecología Mundial. Una disculpa. Una de sus principales aportaciones ha sido la descripción conceptual de lo que él llama el capitaloceno, y seguramente podrá abordar un poco más sobre eso en su presentación. Entre sus publicaciones destacadas recientes se encuentran los libros Capitalismo de la Red de la Vida o Antropoceno o Capitaloceno, Naturaleza, Historia y la Crisis del Capitalismo. En 2003, el doctor Moore recibió el premio Alice Hamilton de la Sociedad Estadounidense de Historia Ambiental y el premio Byers and Bernstein en cambio agrario. Así que, Jason, te dejo la palabra. Te agradezco nuevamente la compañía, el acercamiento a este centro, que desde ya puedes considerar tu casa también. Y nada, muy buena sesión y aquí estaremos acompañándote a lo largo de esta presentación. Adelante. No, perdón, Jason.
Cooperated so that I could be back at UNAM. It is always an honor to speak with comrades and colleagues at UNAM. When I was a boy and growing up, my father regarded it as the Berkeley of Latin America, the great public university of critical thought. And I am honored to be here. I am honored to speak after 40 years of CEIICH and its extraordinary work. I am honored to be a member of this ongoing dialogue. And I will say before I begin properly that much of what I have to say, almost all of what I have to say about interdisciplinarity, disciplinarity, and these processes refers directly to the imperialist heartland, to the question of American hegemony and imperial power over the long run of capitalist history. So while I am critical of multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, these critiques are framed specifically in relation to, as Marx would say, the dominant tendency and not to the popular counter tendencies, such as that represented by CEIICH and many other outposts around the world beyond the United States and the European theater. Well, I want to begin with Upton Sinclair. I will explain who he is in a moment. It is, he wrote, difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon not understanding it. This was a constant refrain in Upton Sinclair's 1934 socialist campaign for governor of California. Sinclair, as some may know, was a socialist writer and author of the classic novel, The Jungle, about the American immigrant experience. The point he makes is simple. It makes clear one of Marx and Engels' most elementary observations. The history of ideas and ideology is a history of social relations, of class society and class struggle. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary, when his identity, when his career depends upon his not understanding it. Well, that phrase goes deeper than one might think. The matter of false consciousness works at more than one level. It works proximately and structurally. For the professional intellectual, not understanding the class historical character of knowledge can be very useful. Embracing the fetish of meritocracy and the cult of the disciplines as repositories of expertise, the career-minded academic pursues knowledge within the tightly policed borders of the knowledge factory. These divisions, the larger ideological structures, such as man versus nature, and the institutional apparatus of the mass university have not dissipated. Over the past half-century, the boom in interdisciplinary studies, one launched aggressively by the American empire and its foundations after World War II, has intensified the disciplinary policing. A critical view focuses on the trinity of the means of mental production, Marx and Engels' great phrase, the means of mental production, the disciplines, the ideologies, the knowledge factories. These have been decisive forces in suppressing the intellectual creativity necessary to confront capitalogenic climate change, that is made by capital, and to imagine a socialism in the web of life for the 21st century. Academics, and I mean academics as a social category, not intellectuals, have long mastered the art of not understanding where their ideas come from. Their salary depends on it. Academics believe in the disciplines. They believe in their discipline. Their battle cry, as an economist, as a scientist, as a philosopher. There are exceptions to the dominant tendency, as I noted, and more in Latin America than in the imperialist heartland, more than usual in this audience, I am very certain. But the dominant tendency, dialectically speaking, is quite evident. Young would-be intellectuals are progressively indoctrinated as undergraduates, as PhD students, as young scholars. Their academic success, and I mean academic success, not intellectual accomplishment, depends on their obedience to the structures of knowledge, and above all, to a specific discipline. Peer review imposes an essentially authoritarian and conservative discipline against heterodox views, often dismissed through the liberal fetish of meritocracy, that heterodox arguments are not rigorous, they are not sufficiently grounded in some imagined empirical basis. Initial employment for young scholars, as we know, is premised on their adherence to disciplinary norms. The disciplines are, after all, job market rackets. That is, racket and as an American idiomatic expression for a mafia organization. The disciplines are organized to preserve and to impose intellectually anemic disciplinary norms and methodological fetishes, and then to reward or deny jobs on that authoritarian basis. Academics who hope to be promoted in the US, this is the tenure system, they must publish in disciplinary journals. Tenure applications are vetted by tenured disciplinary experts in fields defined by disciplinary norms. Senior academics who hope to find better jobs must demonstrate their fidelity to a discipline's sacred objects. For sociology, it's society. For economics, the sacred object is the economy. For environmental studies, it's something called the environment or nature. All this applies to the established disciplines, but it has also shaped interdisciplinary fields such as North American environmental studies. Over the past 4 decades, as public concern over climate crisis has grown and scholarly interest leapt by orders of magnitude, the discipline of environmental studies has demonstrably failed. It has failed to produce knowledge of capital-ogenic, made by capital-ogenic climate crisis as a socio-ecological totality. It has failed from any reasonable or objective perspective because it has succeeded in building knowledge that is useful for capitalist managerialism and the greenwashing of capitalogenic environmental problems. They have served what I call the project of planetary management, which today is discussed through the Anthropocene discourse as planetary stewardship. This is positively Orwellian. These are knowledges that, as in the famous systems dynamics of the limits to growth from 1972, these fragment reality into discrete elements, fractured at every point between man and nature. The holism proposed by most environmental scholars is entirely fraudulent. It considers everything except labor, class, and capitalism's varied metabolisms, joining, as Marx wrote, the soil and the worker. Theirs is a holism of fragments. It is a holism of the rich. Nor has interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, and whatever flavor of the year, word, or term captures the academic hive mind, none of that has changed the problem of the discipline. Here, of course, I echo and elaborate Wallerstein's famous critique of the structures of knowledge and of interdisciplinarity in particular. Everywhere, interdisciplinarity means an amalgamation of disciplines, not a synthesis leading to new knowledge and new institutional forms of teaching and research appropriate to our times. Of course, as noted, there are counter tendencies, but these are minor, and these are not the counter tendencies of the good transdisciplinarity, of the good knowledge movement to remake and reimagine and reinvent the disciplines. Those tendencies are clearly not the tendencies that now dominate the world university system, above all in the imperialist heartlands from Japan to North America to Western Europe. So let me give you an example of the problem of this impasse from North American environmental studies. At precisely the moment when the objective reality of climate crisis speaks to the imperative of forging new knowledge, the knowledge factory has proceeded by fragmenting knowledge through the job market and administrative initiatives. From it have issued academic vacancies and new institutes and programs ever more attuned to planetary management and globalist imperatives to justify and implement a green techno-scientific authoritarianism, often with woke characteristics. At the very moment when big ideas and disruptive thinking are urgently called for, the West's knowledge factory has moved in the opposite direction. Knowledge is produced by the means of mental production, as Marx and Engels underline. Every mode of production implicates the means of mental production in a specific form. Under capitalism, it takes these specific forms. Initially, the two cultures of man versus nature, then the 19th century disciplines, and after World War II, the era of multidisciplinarity and of mass production universities. Each form is not displaced, but rather amplified over the long run of capitalism. These knowledge factories employ intellect workers, to borrow Paul Baran's phrase, whose task is to produce the knowledge necessary for capitalism's instrumental and ideological tasks. Some intellect workers are intellectuals, of course, and there is always a danger that these dangerous intellectuals might experiment with dangerous ideas of democracy, equality, and socialism. There was always a risk that the technical and values-oriented intelligentsias would refuse to comply with the powerful. This was the great concern of Samuel Huntington and the Trilateral Commission as they confronted what they saw as the cultural crisis of the 1970s, a crisis of too much democracy in their view. From that time onwards, from the 70s onwards, the masters of the knowledge factory served their corporate and imperial paymasters to ensure that universities could never again gestate radical ideas. They might be tolerated, but only on the margins. Instead, the disciplines were reinforced, and apace with it, would-be radicals were convinced that radicalism meant a, quote, retreat from class, as Ellen Wood underlined in the 1980s, and the alternative was the embrace of particularity, of the margins, of identitarian division, the rejection of a world historical imagination in Marx and Engels' sense. And ever since, there has been no critical mass of intellectuals in the imperialist West to insist that the central problem is capital, and the fundamental solution flows from the unity of the direct producers. We have no knowledge to support that inside the academy. The academic divides and the imperial bourgeoisie's divide and conquer strategies are two faces of the same wretched process. The alienation of intellectual labor cannot be reduced to the entwined ideological and institutional power of the disciplines and the mass university. But these are central, given monopoly capitalism's dependence, These are central, given monopoly capitalism's dependence on state-funded technical and scientific language, alongside an enlarged proletarian stratum of low to mid-level ideological and technical cadres, especially, ideologically speaking, teachers and university professors. In American parlance, these cadres are now described as the professional managerial class, or simply the PMC. Two issues I clarify at the outset. First, the PMC is known by many names: white collar, professionals, the new class, and the specific formula is unimportant. What is important is this: the PMC is not a class, but a labor market segment and a cultural formation. The PMC evinces a strong proclivity for the fetish of expert rule, technocratic politics, and amongst the values-oriented professionals, identitarianism, and other forms of causal and political pluralism. All of it is conducive to their technocratic liberalism in service to the predator class. For Marxists, today's PMC approximates, in updated form, the labor aristocracy indicted by Lenin over a century ago. This argument then situates the problems of the disciplines and the universities within specific class structures, especially in the imperial core, and within the evolution of the capitalist division of labor. In this light, disciplinary divides, policed by a bloated and unproductive managerial caste in the university, are the academic expressions of the capitalist law of the division of labor. Most conventional disciplines formed as the means of mental production necessary for imperial and domestic rule. Geology was important for the new imperialism of the late 19th century, for instance, sociology to manage the dangerous classes in places like the United States. So what I am narrating has very little to do with the moral and intellectual strengths or weaknesses of specific academic individuals. That would be a liberal story. This is not a liberal story. Like all class societies, capitalism is characterized by a specific logic of the division of labor, which is geographical and technical at once. As capitalism deepens and widens the geographical division of labor, it builds ever more complex imperial and corporate administrative structures, and it pursues the real subsumption of labor to capital, to borrow Marx's phrase. Each moment demands a qualitative expansion. That is, each successive moment of capitalist development demands a qualitative expansion of the cadres, the technical, administrative, and scientific intelligentsia, who are steadily proletarianized in successive waves of capitalist history. I believe that is what Marx and Engels would call a contradiction. This history is grounded in the endless accumulation of capital, which compels the long-run subsumption of labor to capital, the reorganization of production under the law of value. The tendency of real subsumption is eminently Cartesian after Descartes, and the timing is no coincidence. At precisely the moment of the Industrial Revolution of the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, roughly 1550 to 1650, we find rapid proletarianization on both sides of the Atlantic and Descartes' famous formula of thinking and doing. The Cartesian Revolution, completed by Descartes, but actually initiated by the Iberian scholastics in the 16th century, was the intellectual and ideological face of worldwide primitive accumulation. That revolution was defined by 5 major tendencies that aimed to reorganize the web of life in service to profit. First, it imposed an ontological status upon entities as discrete substances rather than webs of relations. This allowed the turning of matter, energy, and even people into things. Second, the Cartesian Revolution enforced a logic of either or, man or nature or society, rather than the dialectical both and. Third, it established a rationality of world conquest through the management of nature via applied science. Fourth, it was profoundly ocular-centric, privileging a disembodied panopticon-like gaze that rendered webs of life visible, measurable, and ready for appropriation. This allowed for the production and appropriation of unpaid work into the vortex of capital accumulation. This is how capital transformed webs of life into abstract nature and thereby a separate ontological domain governed by the science of nature. Finally, and perhaps most interesting and least recognized, the Cartesian Revolution functioned as a sophisticated managerial philosophy, specifically designed to unite imperial coordination and labor management through the separation of conception from execution, to borrow from the great Harry Braverman. This fifth tendency reveals the Cartesian Revolution as the software for an epochal transition in the labor process. This is what the left-wing defenders of Cartesian dualism, like Andreas Malm, have denied. Simply, the Cartesian Revolution articulated a management philosophy shaped by ongoing developments in the productive forces and labor relations, and in turn contributing to that process of the real subsumption of labor by capital. Distinguishing between thinking things and extended things as discrete essences, this is Descartes, and prioritizing the domination of the latter, of the thinking, the domination rather of the essences by the thinking, Descartes crystallized the geocultural premises of work discipline that capitalism required. He did so, as I noted, precisely when capitalism was, in relative terms, effecting the most rapid proletarianization of the past 5 centuries. This is Marx's classic era of primitive accumulation, of course, not limited to England by any stretch of the imagination. Furthermore, Descartes' famous binary included the concept of nature, included in the concept of nature virtually all of humanity: Africans, Celts, Slavs, indigenous peoples, and virtually all women. All would be treated as part of nature, as physical forms to be managed alongside other elements of production. And let me underline, it was the Cartesian revolution that produced the intellectual raw material for these racial and gender categories that were always subsumed under the ruling idea, as Marx and Engels would say, the ruling idea of nature, all taking shape through worldwide primitive accumulation. There was, in other words, a cultural logic, a geocultural logic to primitive accumulation that turned human beings into savages, as they were called at the time. And there is no better example of this imperial naturalism than the reduction of indigenous peoples to a state of nature, to, as Locke would say, to a cultural, within a cultural logic of semi-proletarianization shared by British and Iberian conquerors alike in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. By assigning priority to isolated substances over dynamic relations and favoring applied science for management and commodification, the Cartesian revolution bred a rationality of domination to sustain the endless accumulation of capital. This detachment, this alienation, stifled integrative perspectives, resulting in alienated disciplines where knowledge was pluralized and fragmented, all in the service of managing and sustaining the class struggle from above and managing crises to sustain and justify capitalist rule. Well, this fundamental ideological divide between man and nature, between the civilizers who think and the savages who work, this is Descartes and this is every great civilizer, which I say in very sarcastic terms. This ideological divide between man and nature was institutionalized in the university system of the 19th century. It began in earnest during the rise of monopoly capitalism and its new imperialism after 1870. The legacy of the Cartesian revolution is therefore a mode of thought that prioritizes instrumentalism and fragments knowledge. By the 19th century, the revolution's instrumentalism, enabled through its binary code, man and nature, man and society, and nature, led to progressively fragmented knowledge, culminating in causal pluralism and the initial institutionalization of the disciplines of the new mass universities of the imperial West. The disciplinary revolution was, in every significant way, an extension and elaboration of the Cartesian revolution, and they were, consequently, managerial to the core. As Wallerstein demonstrated, the modern social sciences were constructed in the 19th century around a series of dubious but powerful distinctions that mirrored the capitalist logic of empire. First, past versus present. History, the ideographic study of the past, was separated from the nomothetic social sciences like economics, political science, sociology, which sought universal laws for social history. This, amongst other things, of course, is the history of European universalism. Secondly, the West and the rest. Those same nomothetic disciplines were tasked with studying the civilized present of the West. To study the rest, everyone else, two new disciplines were created, maybe through, let's say, three. Anthropology for the primitive peoples without writing, Oriental studies for the stagnant but advanced civilizations of the West. By the way, I'm not saying they were stagnant. I'm saying this was the worldview and justification of the time. And to that, of course, we would add geography, tasked with mapping empire and mapping the strategic, economic, and political pivots of empire. And also geology, the quintessential scientific discipline of the new imperialism, to map the economic resources of the planet. And third, market, state, and civil society. This led to the classical trinity of economics, political science, and sociology. All basically managerial disciplines par excellence, because, what's the joke about the economist that he predicted 14 of the last 2 economic crises? And you can make the same joke about the Marxists too. Well, these disciplines, so these were ideological and managerial disciplines. They were not necessarily instrumental in many ways, although they did have provide cadres for corporations, for the state, and for the NGO, social welfare layer of society. These disciplinary boundaries were and remain the intellectual architecture of imperial rule, an architecture that would be weaponized in the century to come. To be more precise, the major social disciplines, as I've noted, were organized around social management. So American sociology was created to study and manage America's immigrant population, what the elites regarded as domestic savages. Anthropology was invented to manage primitive peoples. Again, not my term, theirs. For the Eurasian civilizations, we had Orientalism, which was later refashioned into area studies, something I'll touch on in a moment. If the social sciences were about management, the humanities were largely about nation building. Disciplines like history and literature emerged as projects to cultivate national identities and to provide the ideological glue for the modern nation state. These were the intellectual faces of imperialist divide, define, and rule for colonial populations and the domestic savages, so-called, of the imperialist heartland. Well, after World War II, the 19th century structures of knowledge were repurposed and expanded in line with the imperatives of American hegemony. The modern university truly became a mass knowledge factory, first in the US and then across the imperial West. These were the mass knowledge factory signifies the means of mental production corresponding to the logic of monopoly capitalism's mass production. The mass university was the farthest thing from the popular cliche of the ivory tower. It was fundamental to the restructuring of American class society through the white-collar revolution, to the development of the war machine, and to the training of corporate, technical, and administrative cadres to staff the greatest empire in human history. Core elements of post-war American imperial policy were valorized scientifically. I say it sarcastically, of course. They were valorized scientifically by new or newly expanded fields and disciplines, such as area studies, demography, and environmental studies, all generously funded by the empire directly or indirectly through the foundations. The very disciplines we now associate with environmental studies in North America are children of the Cold War. Earth system science, as we know it, emerged directly from the priorities of American Cold War imperialism. Its major strands, demography, cybernetics, and resource management, were yoked to what Senator J. William Fulbright famously called the military-industrial academic complex. It is no coincidence that the Forrester Meadows synthesis in 1972's The Limits to Growth, a foundational text of environmentalism, gestated at MIT, a key strategic partner in the era's war machine, its military-industrial academic complex. This history should make us deeply skeptical of the dominant tendency in today's seemingly progressive calls for interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary thought. Such approaches accept the legitimacy of the existing disciplines and their complicity in capitalist rule. Their approach is fundamentally arithmetic, not synthetic. But even where bourgeois scholars speak of synthesis, it's an abstract synthesis. It's abstracted from the real ground of the class struggle in the web of life, what Marx and Engels called the real ground of history. And assemblages, networks, and systems models, however distinct in many ways, all are forms of bourgeois reductionism whose errors multiply with the addition of each new factor. Abstract causal pluralism, which is very much an invention of the post-World War II period, abstract causal pluralism treats class, race, gender, growth, politics, markets, nature and much beyond as discrete spheres of reality. Everything is now a systems model. The problem reasserts itself in the recent scene craze after the Anthropocene, where so-called critical scholars play with words and provide ideological cover for capital. The awkward plantation of scene is a fine example. This liberal ideology, liberal pluralism, avoids a fundamental critique of capitalism as a unified historical system, fragmenting and particularizing contradictions, which allows their intellectual translation into policy relevance, that is, into management problems, not problems of democracy, but management problems of race, climate, colonialism, all fragmented, all to be governed by the PMC, the professional cadres in service to capital. These ideologists speak in the forked tongues of the liberal elite: polycrisis, climate emergency, sustainability, diversity, and more. Never, never, never class, capital, and imperialism. After World War II, the Rockefeller and Ford foundations were the visible hands behind the post-war invention of the new imperial disciplines. Funding was only a part of their work. They built the institutions, supported the institutions that codified the capitalist system of knowledge, the monopoly capitalist system of knowledge. One of the most successful inventions was area studies. Area studies was a form of interdisciplinarity for imperial management and counterinsurgency. It was designed to produce total knowledge, supposedly, total knowledge of strategic regions, the Slavic and communist world, East Asia, Latin America. This was the old Orientalism reinvented, the old Oriental studies discipline reinvented. And all of that, all of what area studies was doing was building knowledge that would support the effective management of the decolonizing world. Alongside demography and area studies, we see the rapid expansion of environmental studies programs in the United States after 1968. These were not born out of a desire for whatever sustainability means to you, for environmental sustainability. They were not born out of a response to an environmental crisis. There were many environmental problems, but no crisis. Rather, the reinvention of environmental studies after 1968 came out of a long history of eco-managerialism that goes back to the late 19th century, as I've referenced before. We can trace this lineage back to Gifford Pinchot, a scion of a New England bourgeois family, and the Yale Forestry School, which his family funded. And this conservation meant the efficient scientific management of nature as resource for the state and for capital. After 1970, this was updated systematically by an American empire under siege. Virtually all education today conducted under the rubric of environmental studies, at least in Western Europe and North America, is managerial. It is occasionally slathered with virtue hoarding, often of the sort that celebrates blood and soil politics under the sign of a fetishized indigeneity. The pro-capitalist character of environmental studies, which is represents the holism of the rich, as I've indicated, is revealed in the absurd Venn diagram of the 3 pillars of sustainability. If you've ever seen this or taught this, you have a sense of how deeply ideologically oriented the 3 pillars of sustainability are. And the essence of it is that no matter what, business as usual, business sustainability must be supported against all others. They have a lot of nice language about balance and harmony and all of that, but we all know what they are really, truly aiming for. Over the short run, such programs, environmental studies programs, produce low to mid-level cadres for environmental management. They effectively constitute an ecological version of Jim Ferguson's anti-politics machine, which he elaborates in his famous study of development in Lesotho. The anti-politics machines convert political struggles, democratic struggles, popular struggles over land, life, and work into technical problems for experts to solve. Of course, always under the invisible jackboot of the bourgeoisie and its Overton window of realistic policy. As Harry Braverman observed, the logic of scientific management concentrates thinking and doing in, respectively, the minds of the bosses, the thinking, and the hands of the workers, the doers. Under scientific management, a philosophy that emerged in the 17th century, but only matured under monopoly capitalism, under this scientific management, the labor process is progressively fragmented. Workers are correspondingly de-skilled, again, leaning on the great Harry Braverman. Here is the crucial point. This logic of alienation, formal separation, and managerial unification characterizes not only the history of the means of material production, again, Marx and Engels, but also the history of the means of mental production. These form a dialectical unity. The means of mental production. And while these means of mental production have never been limited to the university system, under monopoly capitalism, the universities became a strategic theater of the bourgeoisie's knowledge production and thought control apparatus. Let us return to the normal state of monopoly capitalism. In Baran and Sweezy's great phrase, the normal state is economic stagnation. This has real relevance for intellectual life today. At the very moment when creative and heterodox thinking is most needed to address capitalism's unfolding crisis and the climate change in which it is embedded, the universities, the disciplines, the states, and the foundations have constrained intellectual freedom in every sense of that term. As a blockbuster article in January 2023 issue of the journal Nature reported, there has never been more academic production, there's never been more articles published and less insight produced, less groundbreaking research. The Kuhnian cycle, which was always a liberal fantasy, is decisively broken. Now, academics, with a few exceptions, depend on their career success for not, as I mentioned at the beginning, for not understanding the class historical basis of the structures of knowledge, of the disciplines, of the struggle for ideas. They pretend that ideas fall from the sky. They believe in the disciplines like an evangelical Christian believes in the New Testament. They deny the materialist basis of ideology and how good science, which is anything but good, launders that ideology for respectable company. They refuse to acknowledge a very elementary historical truth about most intellectuals in the modern world. They have been and remain servants of power. To paraphrase the great Noam Chomsky, the more educated you are, the more indoctrinated you are. Again, this is not a moral critique, although I suppose it contains a moral dimension. It is a critique, a class and structural critique of the knowledge factory. I use Mario Savia's words deliberately. Mario Savia was the hero of 1964's free speech movement at Berkeley, a turning point in the development of the New Left in the 1960s. And while there's a recent history, there's also, as I've been mentioning, a longue durée history of the knowledge factory. Consider, for instance, Thomas Malthus teaching at the East India Company College, where he trained generations of imperial administrators in the dark arts of capitalist austerity and genocide from India to Ireland. A tipping point, however, was reached after World War II, as we've seen, when the mass university was born. The disciplines had been developed earlier in provisional form during the rise of monopoly capitalism and the new imperialism, but were now radically augmented because the American elite planners and the foreign policy establishment and the most conscious members of the bourgeoisie understood that the task of American hegemony was to rule the world without formal colonial rule. And for that, you needed a knowledge factory and new interdisciplinary fields like area studies in order to make an appeal to the cadres, the professionals of the third world and to allow for a development program, development in one country. And this was crucial to Cold War politics in every conceivable way. And then area studies and demography as a science, which were closely linked, fuse into what we know as modern environmental studies and virtually all Anglophonic environmental studies. So in the 60s, in 1967, as I mentioned, Senator William Fulbright spoke of a military industrial academic complex from the floor of the United States Senate. That phrase traveled widely in New Left and even liberal circles. Today, those voices have been silenced. Meanwhile, in Western Europe after the war, the billionaire foundations and the CIA worked overtime to neutralize dangerous ideas from intellectuals sympathetic to socialism. This is the story of the Cultural Cold War, recently revisited by Rockhill. By the mid-1960s, the Cultural Cold War came home. A new environmental studies initiative was launched, closely tied to America's effort to contain revolt at home and also to control third world assertiveness. Revolt manifested through socialist revolutions, the non-aligned movement, and later the project for a new international economic order. Well, what do we do with all of this? From here, we might well ask a reasonable and potentially dangerous question. What if the intellectual procedures and academic structures offered to make sense of today's capitalogenic climate crisis are themselves implicated in producing that crisis? Well, that's something that we want to lean into very, very seriously. As Albert Einstein supposedly said, the thinking that created the crisis is unlikely to be the thinking that can resolve that crisis. Well, the structures of knowledge, the disciplines, and the knowledge factories, these constitute the core of the means of mental production. They are, as we have seen, variously instrumental and ideological. Politically, they develop forms of ideological war imposed on the direct producers, as with Malthus in the 19th century, Rostow's Cold War developmentalism in the 1950s and early 60s, Paul Ehrlich and Garrett Hardin's eco-fascist demography and eugenics in 1968. In the 60s, radical critiques of American developmentalism, as Latin Americans know, launched a devastating critique of methodological nationalism. They understood how Truman's point forward developmentalism was simultaneously an intellectual, political, and military project of counterinsurgency. Witnessed the criminal complicity of Rostow in America's war against Vietnam. American developmentalism was an imperial project of development in one country. This was the operative myth. At the time, radicals saw these connections and recuperated Marx and Engels' insistence that the history of capitalism and what they called the real movement of communism are world historical, or they are nothing. Today's radical intellectuals, especially but not only in environmental studies, have abandoned such connections. This is the case with eco-socialism, in Anglophonic or Eurocentric North Atlantic eco-socialism. They have failed to make the necessary connections between environmental studies as academic exercise and the imperialist and class dynamics of planetary management. In so doing, they have aligned themselves with the bourgeois forces. The forces and relations of mental production exist to perform three major tasks under monopoly capitalism. First, to produce the technical, administrative, and scientific intelligentsias necessary to maintain the imperial West's grip on power. That grip, of course, is coming to an end. Secondly, to produce a values-oriented intelligentsia to justify the march towards what Aldous Huxley famously called scientific dictatorship, today centering on climate and environmental state of emergency politics and tightly enmeshed with big tech surveillance. And third, to socialize students, rendering them sufficiently skilled and optimally obedient members of a centrist liberal dystopia and a creeping fascism across the West, led and sparked by the centrist liberals, not by the far right. The far right's doing its damage, to be sure. All of it adds up to an elite strategy to protect the wealth and power of the West's predator class in the present moment of climate crisis. And in the West's project to organize what Samir Amin called a decadent transition to a new mode of production organized from above. On these important questions, the Western left's silence on these matters of the knowledge factory and the disciplines and the formulation of what is environmental politics, all of that is testimony to the Western left's role as a controlled opposition. So even on its own terms, the bourgeois university system has stagnated. And this is the point of the Nature report from 2023 that I indicate, that more and more knowledge is financed and produced in the form of academic papers, and less insight is delivered. This is a stagnation dynamic, the stagnation of the world university system to produce the dynamic and creative thought necessary to help capital do what it wants is not there. And so they are slitting their own throats, but they are also going after the future that the popular classes, the producing classes, want, a democratic theory of knowledge, a democratic approach to knowledge. In short, the knowledge factory's managers have done to intellect work what Taylor's, Frederick Winslow Taylor's cruel scientific managers did to physical work at the dawn of monopoly capitalism. They fragment and disassemble knowledge under managerial control. Each academic worker is correspondingly de-skilled, as Braverman recognized, only there's a big difference in all that. The craftsmen of the early 20th century understood what was happening to them. Today's elite intellect workers misunderstand it and find such academic de-skilling necessary, desirable, and virtuous. To return to Sinclair's observation, for these intellect workers, their liberalism depends on them not understanding the class forces behind the de-skilling of intellect work in the knowledge factory. Well, how should the popular forces respond? One thread of proletarian response has come from inside the knowledge factory, and I speak to the North American scene. Here, intellect workers have organized labor unions and even struck, most famously in 2022 at the University of California. Other strikes at the New School, Temple, and elsewhere have been led by the academic lumpen proletariat, PhD students, adjunct faculty, and other casualized workers. By and large, the professoriate is missing in action. This speaks to the ways that bogus academic expertise and academic professional identity combine to prevent the tenured professoriate from grasping their fate as workers in the final analysis. As C. Wright Mills observed in 1951, the professionals, the white collars, are always discovering that they too are disposable workers. But, and this is important, they often discover the reality much too late. Labor aristocracies invariably understand their disposability much too late. Well, as ever, our clarity in this difficult moment must be earned through a critique of capitalism's class historical forces and the patterns of history, the real ground of history, through which capitalist reproduction is achieved, relying heavily on the means of mental production. Some of you may know my argument about the Capitalocene. This is widely misunderstood. And so let me put, in terms of the present argument, its real significance. That every era of capitalism depends upon what I then called a decade ago, a trinity of capital, science, and empire. It depends on scientific knowledge, instrumentally and ideologically, to reproduce itself in successive waves of capitalist development. And in this sense, as in all the other senses, the essential dialectical unity of power, profit, and life is addressed not only materially, but also through the symbolic and scientific and cultural apparatus that is functionally necessary at every turn for capitalist development to occur. This is the importance of the Cartesian revolution and what I've called the software of imperial domination, always in service to, of course, the endless accumulation of capital. So clarity is important if we wish to confront and disrupt bourgeois hegemony over the means of mental production. Otherwise, critique becomes liberal critique and yields the abstract celebration of resistance, and not what is most needed, a revolutionary program to advance a proletarian conception of knowledge, the one science advocated by a young Marx. We must begin, as with Marx and Engels, by piercing the fog of bourgeois fetishes and their academic faces, and understanding the class forces behind the decadence of the West's universities. This implicates not only ruling class forces, but also their conceptive ideologists, again from Marx and Engels, the bourgeoisie's elite intellect workers, proper and respectable academics, and the purveyors of good science across the two cultures. The structures of knowledge that dominate our university, especially the great divorce between the two cultures of science and the humanities, and the subsequent fracturing of the humanities and social sciences into many disciplines, these are not neutral, timeless frameworks. They are concrete historical institutions forged in the blood and dirt of imperial conquest and designed to legitimize and enable capitalism by obscuring its class historical relations in favor of technical and managerial fixes. Our struggle involves resistance against the capitalist knowledge factory and its managerialism, but resistance then is clearly insufficient. We need to go further. Against that, I would highlight against the capitalist logic of fragmentation, mechanical unification, and managerial expertise stands Marx's perspective, which I have called the standpoint of the proletariat in the web of life. Our theoretical struggle in the climate crisis must then look again at Marx's revolutionary epistemological hope for, quote, a natural science that will in time incorporate into itself the science of man, just as the science of man will incorporate itself into natural science. There will be one science, Marx wrote. Pivotal to the tasks of planetary socialism, then, must be the transcendence of an epistemic rift, one that is always already ideological and geocultural, and therefore fundamental to bourgeois hegemony. We must look to the possibilities for creating a one science, in Marx's terms, a necessarily proletarian science, a term strenuously avoided by the eco-socialist left. This would, as Marx indicates, integrate the differentiated unities of human sociality in the web of life. The proletarian science would, among other tasks, inform the communist possibilities of advancing the forces of production through cooperation and knowledge freed from the prison house of the Cartesian revolution. And this is no academic quibble. This is no revolutionary posturing. These ideas have been circulating for a very, very long time and have been suppressed not only by centrist liberals and the university system, but even by most of the academic left. It's necessary to begin to make sense of the class dynamics of the biosphere in a way that is not fragmentary. It is not a separation of different groups, but understands the essential insight as a metabolic and class synthesis of how the world proletariat, which is always a semi-proletariat, as I've argued repeatedly, with Wallerstein, with Federici, with von Verhoeven, with many others, that the proletariat is also the unpaid work of the femitariat and the biotariat, that we must look for ways to ground our biospheric and planetary politics within a one science. Well, to conclude then, these are obviously political questions that involve academia. They are the kinds of serious intellectual questions once vigorously debated by socialists before neoliberalism came around. If the climate crisis is indeed epochal, it will be resolved politically. This is one of Marx's fundamental points. The progressive forces cannot hope to win the political struggle without engaging the ideological struggle and the profound falsifications of bourgeois thought produced in and through the world university system. Above all, those of man, nature, and civilization. A brief example, no, the climate crisis is not made by man. It is not anthropogenic. It is capitalogenic. It is made by capital. And this is not some abstract statement. This is a statement of fact. We know that the top 150 corporations in the world are responsible for 70% or more of greenhouse gas emissions since 1850 or the 1750s. You can look at various figures, for instance, from the Climate Majors Project. Nor can we hope to rebuild a world along socialist principles without a proletarian science that synthesizes, to paraphrase Mao, the red, the green, and the expert. This entails a relentless struggle to seize the means of production, mental production, and to pursue genuinely creative and cooperative and democratic solutions to the climate crisis and to the building of socialism in the 21st century. To paraphrase the great anti-imperialist Samir Amin, the historical moment we inhabit is one of profound transition. It can be a decadent transition managed from above by a techno-authoritarian ruling class, using nature and environmental crisis and climate emergencies and virus emergencies to consolidate its power. That's one possibility. Or it could be a revolutionary transition in Amin's terms, forged from below, guided by the standpoint of the planetary proletariat in its struggle for a just, democratic, and socialist world. That choice between a decadent and revolutionary transition is not academic. That choice is being made now in the streets, in the fields, on the picket lines, and the battlefields. The task of a revolutionary science is not merely to interpret these events, but to provide the clarity necessary to prevent defeat and guide the producers to a democratic triumph. In revolutionary moments, as Marx once observed, ideas too may become revolutionary material forces. The question is not which path, decadent or revolutionary, to choose. That is obvious. The question is rather whether we have the courage to follow it, whether we have the capacity to navigate by the lodestar of a proletarian science, red, green, and expert, and whether or not we find it possible to build the revolutionary option on the way, on the road. Thank you very much.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Jason, por tu presentación, por la claridad, por una presentación provocativa intelectualmente y que seguramente va a ser parte de una conversación posterior. Tengo algunas preguntas que nos hicieron llegar del auditorio que nos acompaña hoy, así que las voy a formular para que puedas tú eventualmente reaccionar. Quiero empezar con una pregunta que amablemente ya nos hicieron en inglés, así que la voy a leer así para honrar un poco y no doble traducir. Pero son básicamente dos preguntas un poco vinculadas con tu trabajo con Patel sobre lo que llama nuestra colega Jimena the Meat Industrial Complex. Y la primera es, how can we bring animals into our critical analysis, into sociology? And should sociology start decentering humans as the only important matter? Y en segundo lugar, nos pregunta nuestra colega, how can sociology integrate the web of life and other species without falling into the social Darwinism that most sociologists fear? Esa sería un par de preguntas que nos presenta nuestra colega que nos acompaña aquí. Ernesto pregunta, esto ya lo hago en español, entiendo que te están traduciendo en vivo, ¿cuáles son las exigencias para la ecología mundo en un mundo o en un contexto en el que los Estados Unidos presenta un declive hegemónico y resurge China como centro del sistema mundial? siguiendo un poco tu trabajo, cita la persona que pregunta, Ernesto, el trabajo de Giovanni Amigi, Adam Smith sobre Pekín. Y por último, nuestro colega Lev Jardón pregunta, ¿de qué manera se podría lograr una nueva síntesis o defragmentación del conocimiento que sirva a la emancipación del proletariado y los pueblos oprimidos? Y redondea con una segunda pregunta, ¿cómo recuperar, por tanto, la aspiración de Marx en los manuscritos de 1844 en pos de una sola ciencia, la ciencia de la historia, o el punto de vista de la historia natural del capital? Esas, digamos, serían así como para abrir boca, pedirte que redondeara sobre ello, a reserva de que tuviéramos tiempo eventualmente para una segunda intervención. Pero por lo pronto, creo que you have enough on your plate, my friend, so adelante, por favor.
Yep. Are you ready for me now? Yes?
Yes, sí.
Okay, perfect. Well, while I have never been a world systems analyst, I have been completely convinced by Wallerstein's critique of the structures of knowledge and the disciplines. One reason why Wallerstein could never be elected president of the American Sociological Association is that from 1971 forward, he ridiculed and mocked sociology, calling it and all the other disciplines dubious disciplines or so-called disciplines. If you have not read these essays, I encourage you to do so. Now, most of the followers of Wallerstein fell into line with the Knowledge Factory for precisely the reasons that I indicated in the lecture. So sociology, I don't think North American environmental sociology has been very good. I don't think it's been very smart, and many of you would know my disagreements with John Bellamy Foster, who basically pretends to be an orthodox Marxist, and then his most famous concept has nothing to say about the specificity of labor in capitalism, has nothing to say about the proletarianization process and class formation and the class dynamics of the class dynamics of environmental change and the environmental dynamics of class formation. So my argument is that both human-centered and biocentric are bourgeois fetishes. Marx's approach is, I think, fairly clear, and I have argued this, including in the new preface to Capitalism in the Web of Life. A Spanish translation will appear very soon, and I will put it on my website, where I outline Marx and Engels' labor theory of life. This is very clear that what Marx is presenting is a labor theory of environmental change within a web of life that often produces non-dialectical problems. For example, when a volcano erupts, that is not a dialectical event. However, in the history of class societies, how a class society responds to the climate changes that follow a volcanic event, that is dialectical. So webs of life for Marx and Engels are both produced and they are also given. A mountain range is given. Can a mountain range be destroyed? Well, maybe. And if you go to small mountain ranges, like in West Virginia, yes, where coal mountaintop removal has been practiced. But you get the picture that there are dialectical and non-dialectical contradictions in the web of life. The center cannot be ecology. That is the road of fascist and quasi-fascist ecological thinking. That is what led Ernst Haeckel to Lebensraum in the early 20th century when he co-founded the German Monist League. And he's not alone. Look at many holisms, the holism of James Lovelock, very much biocentric. And Lovelock was an eco-fascist. So I could multiply these many times over. Garrett Hardin of Tragedy of the Commons. So when we begin with the laws of nature abstracted from humans and the human labor process, we're in trouble. However, by the same token, sociology has been very successful, along with most of the other social science disciplines, at narrating the dynamics of social change abstracted from the web of life. So there is a nature reductionism and a human reductionism problem, and the existing options are insufficient. So my standpoint, the world ecology perspective, is the standpoint of the proletariat in the web of life. It foregrounds the labor process and understands that labor takes many, many different forms, including, as Marx and Engels note in the German ideology, the labor of intergenerational reproduction. Nobody quotes that. Only Silvia Federici and I quote that. So there is an intergenerational moment of production. It is, they say in the same passage, social and natural at the same time. This is Marx and Engels' labor theory of life. It is not an assemblage. It is not an actor network something. It is not a systems model. It is a dialectical approach to comprehend a reality that does not always work in dialectical terms. So solar cycles, for instance, or volcanic eruptions. There are huge questions, but to pursue those questions, we must go outside the disciplines. And to go outside the disciplines means that you will enrage the disciplinary practitioners. So there is a reason why in any disciplinary or interdisciplinary framework in North America, I'm completely marginal. I might be cited, I might be listened to occasionally, but I'm completely marginal because this argument is a direct threat to the bourgeois construct of the disciplines. All right, American hegemony, China's rise. Yes, of course, that's already happening. China has won. The US, as we know, is retrenching into the Western Hemisphere. That's why it's engaging in all sorts of criminal activity. This is not a Trump problem. This is not a Biden problem. This is an American imperial problem. And while Trump is more brazen, certainly the stage was already set by Obama and Biden and all the rest, with kill lists and funding outrageous wars and everything else. So the big question in terms of my lecture is, what does that mean for the structures of knowledge? And I don't know. I think that the universities have been home to the most dynamic and creative thinkers when the working classes have been very strong. And by working classes, I also include agrarian classes of labor. I am Wallersteinian in this regard. The normal state of the proletariat is the semi-proletariat. Unpaid work is central for every proletarian moment. There is a biotarian, that is the work of webs of life as a whole, a feminitarian moment, the unpaid work of feminized labor, not necessarily female. And that's that if we want to support more creative and dynamic thinking on a mass scale, then we have to build the power of the working class movements, and we have to build a political program to push social democrats in the third world to the left, and to build alliances within places like the United States and Western Europe, which are essentially fascist regimes with a liberal cover today. So that's a very different kind of struggle with different, and we'll have to see. We should talk more about it. Defragmentation, the answer is the same. That when professional class intellectuals are left to their own, they like to be clever. They like to fragment. They imagine a world that they can manage and control. This is not speculative. In the United States, certainly from the early 1940s, when Burnham wrote The Managerial Revolution, there has been and even earlier, something called the International Technocracy Movement in the 1930s. There's always been the fantasy of a genuine managerial revolution and technocratic control, but always the technocrats end up serving capital. So, but my point is that fragmented knowledge is technocratic knowledge. And that the Imperial CIA State Department line from the 1940s onward was to destroy holistic knowledge that took seriously labor and class. So again, if we want to defragment, if we want to transcend the de-skilling, the disassembling of knowledge, then we have to identify how the advocates of complexity often fall into a very Cold War pluralism that served the imperial state because it's a managerial ethos. This has always been my disagreement with the critical theorists, with people like Donna Haraway, who think that if they just make everything very complex, then that's fine. Today we call it assemblage theory or actor network theory, and they all serve the same masters. So if we want to defragment, that is, if we want to pursue an authentically Marxist project of synthesis, that will involve many risks, personal risks to one's career, but also political risks to build working class movements, to carry forth a political program that would allow for more projects like CEIICH and more projects like the Fernand Braudel Center before it was killed by its own leaders. So the Fernand Braudel Center and Wallerstein Center was premised on Marx's one science. Wallerstein called it unidisciplinarity, which I always thought was awkward, but that was what he was doing. And so, of course, he left, and his followers proceeded to destroy as near as I can tell, one of the few institutional faces of genuine unidisciplinary thought in the world. Not the only one, but one of the very few. I hope that answered some of the questions, or some part of those wonderful questions.
Seguramente sí. Muchas gracias, Jason. Una última pregunta que nos han formulado acá. No sé si Mauricio quieras añadir algo para preguntarle a Jason, pero por lo pronto te lo planteo así para también invitarte a ir cerrando un poco la presentación. Ha sido muy grato escuchar tus puntos de vista, tu formulación, muy sólida, muy potente en términos intelectuales, así que ha sido muy grato escucharte. Concluyo con esta pregunta que nos plantea Francisco también. ¿Cuáles son y dónde están los espacios para organizar esta transición revolucionaria de la que tú has hablado? ¿Qué rol, es la segunda pregunta, pueden tener los académicos, las académicas en estos espacios? ¿Cómo generar esta cooperación entre lo que se llama, por quien pregunta, estos lumpenes intelectuales y los obreros digamos, a la luz de los movimientos del 68, es decir, cómo elaborar un poco este contexto sociohistórico en la actualidad? Y sí, Mauricio te quiere formular una pregunta adicional. Adelante.
Gracias. Muchas gracias por la presentación, Jason, por tu análisis sobre la investigación interdisciplinaria en nuestros días. Sobre todo me gustó mucho esta mirada crítica de esta experiencia académica dentro de tu propio país, ¿no? En el mundo occidental. Me invitas con todo esto a recuperar una vez más en su lectura crítica desde el mundo francés a Pierre Bourdieu en el sistema académico, ¿no? En la reproducción, y lo que él señalaba constantemente como este sistema educativo es solamente una máquina de reproducción. Yo creo que sí es bien importante traerlo de nuevo a la mesa en nuestros días para tener este análisis, ¿no? Tangencial sobre este sistema de reproducción que no permite una crítica, y desde luego desde nuestro centro que busca tener esa misión interdisciplinaria, ¿no? Esa visión interdisciplinaria. Lo que me queda en cuestión también es cuando abordas lo visual, creo que está dentro del marco bien especificado que has señalado, pero creo que hay rutas críticas dentro de los estudios visuales y que han roto un poco, por ejemplo, se oponen a todo lo que era una tradición histórica de lo que era el arte canónico desde Occidente y que era en la historia del arte la materia fundamental. Estos estudios visuales parten de una crítica precisamente a esos cánones y no necesariamente reproducen, sino que ponen en cuestión cómo el mundo ha sido representado desde los parámetros occidentales de belleza o de estética occidental. Creo que ahí, por ejemplo, el trabajo de Niklas Mirsov es muy importante con la contravisualidad. No solamente hay que ver una manera el mundo, hay que ver lo que nos dice el policía, poniendo ese ejemplo Mirsov, ¿no? De que cuando hay un accidente, el policía está diciendo, pase, pase, no, no se quede aquí a mirar. Bueno, yo quiero ver lo que está pasando ahí y ahí yo creo que tenemos una misión también muy crítica desde la visualidad. De nada, muchas gracias por esta participación y estaremos atentos a seguir este intercambio contigo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Let me respond briefly in response to these two fantastic questions about the visual arts, 100%. And this is why I built into the core of the world ecology perspective and into the core of the capital Ocene thesis, the strategic role of Western knowledge as ocular centric, the strategic function of representations such as mapping, or in the recent history, and I've continued to write about these questions in the decade since then, especially in relation to modern environmentalism and the fetishes of blue marble from 1972, of Earthrise from 1968 or 9, and the ways in which such strategic mapping has been at once instrumental. So the Mercator projection and mapping, those are as fundamental an instrumental tool of empire as you can get. And I've often said out loud, it surprises me that everyone thinks the steam engine was the cause of capitalist modernity. If there was a key technical innovation, it was the modern map. Because you can't build a global empire. You can't build an overseas empire without modern mapping. But those also serve ideological functions. And I think that's what your question is pointing towards. That is 100% correct. And you are 100% accurate to emphasize that the critique of an ocular-centric, visualized knowledge system is one of the strategic critiques we need to make to break through the fog of these disciplinary fetishes. That's hugely important. The problem with opening new space in the university, what can the tenured university professors do? I think what they need to be, if what one wants is actual democratic and egalitarian knowledge, one needs to first organize in one's own house. And the labor aristocracy of the tenured professoriate thinks that the privileged labor market, the tenure system, protects them. As we know, it doesn't. And we've been seeing many, many instances of this over the past 5 years. But they believe it. They believe it like a fundamentalist Christian believes that the New Testament is the exact word of God. They have this self-deception around that is extraordinary. And as Catherine Liu has remarked in relation to the European, especially the American professional managerial class, they hate the working class. So they have a fear that they are going to fall into the lumpen elements. But instead of joining force with the casualized short-term academic workers. They continue to support an administration, and I don't know what it looks like in Mexico, but I can tell you in North America and in Western Europe, but especially in North America, the size of the administration has grown and grown and grown beyond any reasonable functional explanation. So as my friend Christian Parenti recently quipped, he said, well, you know, there's sometimes an argument for left austerity. And one good target of left austerity is to reduce these bloated, hypertrophied, oversized administrative classes that are simply interested in the reproduction of the knowledge factory for its own use. These are people who, by and large, have no interest in research, have no interest in teaching, have no interest in the core values of a university and a democratic society. They run them like factories. And as an old-fashioned socialist, I'm not against factories, but I think the factories ought to serve the people, not the bosses and the managers. So that is a perhaps long-winded way of saying that the tenured professors need to join forces with the casual lecturers, with the PhD students, with all the workers of the university, because the university should exist not just for them, but the university should be controlled by popular power and serve popular power. Now, that's a complex program that can't be reduced to a slogan. I know that. If we want to build out a genuine synthesis, then we look at moments when there were powerful movements towards synthesis. In North America, this was the late 60s and early 70s, when you had many sons and daughters of the working class come into the universities and become professors. And they entertained the absurd idea that professors should serve the people instead of serving the rulers. We should be more like Michael Parenti or Howard Zinn and less like Henry Kissinger.
Muchas gracias nuevamente, Jason, por tu
Thank you.
presentación y muchísimas gracias a todas y a todos que nos acompañaron hoy, también la gente que nos siguió en línea en nuestra transmisión por YouTube, así que estaremos en contacto con las próximas actividades que realizaremos aquí en el centro con motivo de estos 40 años, pero creo que hoy empezamos con un evento muy importante, muy relevante y nuevamente muchas gracias, Jason. Espero que más adelante, cuando te mejores de salud, puedas estar aquí con nosotros presencialmente. Ya estaremos en contacto.
Muchas
Suerte
gracias.
con eso, muchas gracias y muy buen día a todas y a todos. Gracias.
Thank you. It has been an honor.
El CEIICH agradece la presencia de todas y todos. Muy buenas tardes.